I'm a scientist, so I actually, my job is to advance knowledge along with my colleagues in the scientific community, so it's very important for me that the knowledge that we produce is really universal and applicable irrespective of what culture you come from and what geography, geographical boundary you live in. So we already know that this is a big challenge for autism research. It's a challenge for broader areas of research. This is one of my favorite articles that sort of was a few from the kind of series of articles that sort of came out with a critique of what we're doing in some of our research fields. So they described the weirdest people in the world. And essentially what they showed in this article is a vast majority of research findings that get published in psychology literature comes from a relatively narrow and unrepresentative sample of the human race. So basically, in most of our studies, the people that get included tend to fall in these weird categories. So Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic, right? And I guess we have similar challenges in autism research. Over time, I found myself becoming what I can call the poster child of this new direction in research, which is very strange because, as I said, I think I liked Richard's term this morning. I come from a hyper-diverse family. I live in a hyper-diverse community. I work in an institution that cares about hyper-diversity. So it seems pretty strange that our research literature and the approach to it is not reflecting that necessarily, and that it's sort of taken us quite some time to get sort of to a realization of that. But the good news is that that sort of space is shifting. So one of the first sort of big projects that we carried out was several years ago, working with about 12 researchers and clinicians from around the world on a report that was requested by the World Health Organization, who posed two questions to us. One was, what is the global prevalence of autism? And the second was whether we could identify any impact of culture, geography, ethnicity, or income. So in relation to the first question, we sort of refused to answer it by saying, well, look, the variation is actually really huge. So you can see here the median figures of prevalence. This was in 2012 for the broader autism spectrum disorder. And you can see that the variation is so much greater than what we would like to have as a representative figure. So instead of answering the question by providing kind of a single figure that says how much autism there is in the world, we highlighted that first the literature that we're basing this on is primarily unrepresentative of the world population. So most of the studies come from North America and Northern Europe. So we don't have as much literature that is coming out. So the study that you heard about from Dr. Grinken this morning was one of those minority studies that come from the rest of the world. But we also highlighted several reasons why we have the variation in prevalence. In fact, on my count, there was over 16 reasons why we find this variation. I think you heard about a lot of these reasonings this morning. So we keep changing our mind about what autism is every few years. So there's sort of a uniform ascertainment criterion that we're using for it. A lot of methodological differences in how the studies approach their samples and what they measure exactly. You heard from Richard about diagnostic substitution, the fact that kids who used to be labeled something like mental retardation are now being labeled autism, differences in service provisions, awareness, and health disparities. So essentially, there's solid evidence to suggest that there's indeed variation by geography, but that doesn't necessarily imply that there is either an increase or a difference to be explained in incidence. And this is sort of a key difference. So prevalence is sort of like a snapshot that we take at any moment in time in any given place. But incidence is how many true new cases get added to that pool every year. And we don't have any evidence to suggest a true increase in incidence. It might be there, but we just don't know that that's the case because we don't have good data to show these types of differences. So our answer to the impact of geography, culture, income, and ethnicity is that yes, they modify the person's experience with autism for sure. and lots of you have shared your own stories for how important that is. But we don't think that the underlying biology of autism, how it manifests early on in life, is very different across these different dimensions. There was a huge number of what I ended up referring to as just so stories, trying to explain these variations in numbers as something reflecting an underlying difference in the biology. So one of my favorite stories that I see as a new iteration of the refrigerator mother theory is that basically trying to explain why there's a difference in prevalence in a minority in a Scandinavian country that basically said that those men who are on the broader autism spectrum disorder, who are socially incompetent and unable to mate with women from the default culture, would instead marry Black immigrant women, and that's why you get a rise in prevalence in their offspring, and that was an explanation for it. So I don't know about you guys, but I find these kinds of stories not just disconcerting as a person, but also as a scientist. It's what we appropriately can label a just so story. It's just I see a piece of data, and I try to come up with an explanation, because I just can't think of a better one in that moment. Okay? So I think it's just something to be very mindful of when we're trying to explain those differences, and I think very relevant for what we're talking about, because it poses the question of, are we doing research for the rich and research for the poor? Are we developing a tool for English speakers and a tool for other language speakers? I mean, what is it that we're doing, and what kind of reference point are we using? So it's just things to keep in mind when we're trying to address something as challenging as the topic that you guys are trying to deal with. So to just give you sort of the positive direction it's going. So these are examples, including from Dr. Grinker's work, some of the publications that have been appearing in the mainstream scientific literature with lots of critique about how we're doing autism research and the kinds of barriers that people who are trying to do this research outside these what we call highly unrepresentative populations, what kind of challenges are they facing, and what we need to do about it. And essentially, with many colleagues from around the world, we started to point out this idea that actually doing research with this sort of global perspective is really important for the science itself, right? So there are many opportunities, to basically give you one examples of them. So even when we are doing something like genetics research or trying to understand the underlying biology, there's definitely a need for broader, more representative populations, but at the same time, those can be ideal opportunities to build capacity for research in countries that don't have that pre-existing capacity, and to develop the networks and collaborations that are capable of supporting that. And it's very nice to actually see now a lot of these newer sets of studies that had been supported and are increasing the number of studies and essentially large-scale data sets that are coming from previously underrepresented populations. So I think maybe the big take-home message that was echoed very much in this World Health Organization report that came out last year is that irrespective of whether you're a researcher, an educator, a community organizer, there are 4 themes that we're all grappling with and that are really important in what we do. And I sort of see the topic of today as an extension of these. One is the importance of being mindful and that we're still discovering the biological basis of autism, despite the fact that we understand that it is definitely a biological condition. The major variability, heterogeneity that we see in the population that's becoming more the default rather than the exception. The importance of understanding development, and that we can't simply take snapshots of people's lives and think that we are able to explain the full phenotype. And then the broader importance of the family and community context. And I hope that you'll see examples of those in what follows.